Hi everyone. Hopefully you can see me okay, you can hear me okay. Let me know. Great, sounds like you can. A couple of comments coming in. Hi everybody, hope everyone's all right. So it's Ben from Rare Consulting here. I think a fair few of you have been on these calls before, so hello, welcome back. And hi to anybody that's new to these sessions. So my name's Ben. I'm from Rare Consulting. We're a research and product development company. And we've been tracking how consumers have been responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. Today's session, I'm going to be taking through some of the latest data we've got, talk to you about some of the more recent trends, bigger, smaller trends, all sorts of different interesting things that we're seeing going on. If you're new to GoToWebinar, then there's on the little control panel, you can ping me any questions as we go through. We will have a Q&A at the end. There's a couple of things that actually came in the on the registration form this week, so I'll address those first. But if there's anything that comes to mind, anything you want to discuss about the data, then please feel free to just put your questions as we go through. So what you can expect from today, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the project, what we're doing for those that are new. We'll talk through some of the interesting macro trends that we're seeing at the moment. Then we'll go through our brand reputation data and then different overviews into sectors that we've been focusing on over the past three and a half months. I've sort of lost time really. I don't know about you guys, but yeah, it's kind of crazy that August is around the corner really. In terms of sectors that we look at in more specific detail, it's grocery, alcohol, retail, beauty, DIY, and exercise. And this week we'll be doing a deep dive in travel because we've got quite a lot of data there, and as well as we'll have a discussion around how people feel about going back to bars and restaurants. I actually went to I had my first pub experience for 4 months yesterday, and it was okay actually. It was all right. I felt quite safe, but it was in the middle of nowhere, so that might have been part of the reason. So in terms of the research, we've been really trying to understand how attitudes, feeling, sentiment has changed over the past 14 weeks. It has huge implications on not just comms, but also service design and various other things that many of you will be responsible for on this call. We're also looking at how behaviours are adapting over this period. So are we seeing huge shifts online, as we're seeing a lot in the press? We certainly are in some categories. What's the future of the high street look like? What's the impact of people not being able to go to school or to work on their local economies and the economies around where their place of work is? Lots of different things we've been looking at. In terms of the methodology, we interview between 900 to 1,000 people per week. There are some fluctuations, of course, on our tracker, and we also, our brand reputation data, we are sampling 500 people per week on that and asking them whether they believe brands have responded well, whether they trust them, and whether they like them in addition. So it's quite interesting to see in different sectors how performance has changed, how it's evolved, and actually seeing how different sectors overall, more broadly speaking, have been perceived throughout this pandemic. It's quite interesting that it's not consistent. Some sectors have done quite well compared to others. So in terms of macro context this week, it's quite an interesting one in terms of hopes for the future. The Bank of England came out saying that actually it does look like currently, of course, we'll have to remain to be seen, that a V-shaped recovery is looking possibly likely to be the case. Roughly half of the 25% fall in revenue that we saw in March and April was made up for in the period after that. So it's quite encouraging to see. And I think amongst all the melee of initiatives and things that are being rumoured, in particular, I thought it was interesting that Rishi Sunak's considering a 2% tax on online retail, which is a curious move. In lots of ways, it can obviously bring in revenue to HMRC, which is of immense benefit. But there's I think when we're looking at these kind of these sort of initiatives, there's a broader picture at stake. And I think it's good to see and encouraging to see that government are seeking evidence for a review on business rates. So those of you in retail or in hospitality will know it's such an extortionate lay down for any business just to operate, and I think it's encouraging to see that being addressed, or at least evidence being gathered to have a discussion about it. In the holiday sector, obviously there's loads of stuff that's been happening this week with British holiday makers having their trips to Spain pulled or told they're going to have to go into quarantine after their trips and their stays. Lots of rumours about whether other countries might be affected, question marks as to whether or not this is a, for genuine health reasons or political move, who knows, but equally it will have a huge impact on people's desire to stay and spend in the UK. And we're seeing in our data that there's a great deal of appetite for people to invest in British, and that's not just in terms of holidays, but also just in products and services in general. So there's some, I think for lots of companies in the UK, there's some encouraging signs there. So yeah, an interesting one in terms of the context. I thought before we get into the research itself, as you know, for those of you who've been on these calls, we're looking at what consumers feel hopeful for, what they're looking forward to, and it's evolved certainly over the past few weeks. But I thought I'd ask you. I've never really asked you guys this question actually, so it's quite interesting. You have to bear in mind it's fairly limited on GoToWebinar, so I can't ask you everything. But what are you looking forward to? Little tip for polls: if you are struggling, if the radio buttons don't work for you, if you minimize your screen and shrink it down, you'll be able to vote, but no problem. So more than half of you voted, 65% of you voted, 70% of you voted. Going to give you a couple more moments. Cool. All right, I think that's, oh no, a few more votes coming in. Okay, so your options are, what are you looking forward to? Spending time with your friends and family holiday, going shopping, or going back to the office. It's interesting. I'm just quite curious to sort of see. You have to pardon my spelling error. There was a minor edit I made before we started the session. So holiday. 71% of you looking forward to holidays, spending time with friends and family. No one saying going back to the office. Interesting. I think that's the same for lots of people, despite what Nick Ferrari might say on LBC. Certainly an appetite to stay at home. So yeah, it's interesting that what we're looking forward to is that it's very much in line with the general public. It's still the case that we're looking forward to spending time with our family, our friends, to experiencing things. And holiday and travel has been one that's really has grown over time. We've seen that as a future aspiration and hope move from around 4% 2 months ago to being 12% now. So it really has grown over that period. Those of you that are familiar with this data and seen it before, I think there's another thing to really pull out here, which is that interest in going to the pub has diminished from 5%, and that's been pretty consistent and steady throughout the past few months at around 2%. And for shopping, we've seen that peak at 5% people, and that's currently at 3%. And you wonder whether, to some extent, this is about the sort of a suboptimal experience that we're getting from certain places. I mean, it's really interesting to go, even just experience going into shops, going into pubs, and just seeing how they're handling things. It is it's quite a strange experience for the desire to make you feel safe. I'm going to talk to you about a couple of really interesting innovations that are happening in the grocery sector to encourage people to feel more safe and improve that experience when they're going to physical locations. It's certainly going to be a focus. But overall, it's consistent in regards to what we hope, where we want to spend our time in the future. It's all very experiential. It's all very much about connecting with other people and being able to go places and to experience things. Commercial aspects aren't necessarily at the forefront of people's minds at the moment. And you can see how that evolves over time. So it's interesting that desire for travel has increased. I'm just showing you data here from May. We've been capturing it for a longer time period. Just try and fit it all on a slide. It's a bit of a job to do. But as you can see, that has increased over time. In terms of our sense of community with our family and our desire to spend time with the family. Obviously, as lockdown measures have changed in more recent weeks, we're able to see our family, and we have seen that there's been a slight suppression in that being top of mind in terms of our desires and hopes. But there's certainly in the language that we're seeing much more positive sentiment coming out, people being able to reconnect and spend time with people, and that's encouraging. However, we are seeing a couple of interesting things to go alongside this. Firstly, the intentions are really diverging. So you're seeing that people are actually looking forward to lots of different aspects that might have been sort of niche interests they had that they couldn't engage with during the lockdown, that that they're going to be at forefront of their mind into the future. And I think the second thing to point out as well is that we still have 89% of the UK feeling concerned about coronavirus, and we know in our data that the more that people are concerned, they're less likely they are to engage. And we've seen that not just with the public data that we're gathering, but also in projects for clients at the moment across sectors. It's very much impacting people's desire to engage, certainly in a physical space. In terms of our sense of community, this is interesting to see as well, because I think that this diversification of hope and what we're looking forward to in the future has had a bit of an impact, I think, in terms of where we feel our sense of community. The two things do correlate together in a fairly interesting manner. We've seen over time that sense of community with friends and family remains strong, and for others and our sense of community towards others and other people around the world has diminished more or less week in, week out. I think it's going to be interesting to see how local areas respond to this notion that people are going to be working from home more, spending more in their local economies, and it'd be interesting to see in terms of planning for brands. You're seeing lots of stories about lots of companies moving out of city centres. I think Pret have announced they're going to be closing 30 stores. It's going to be really difficult to maintain the economy we were used to in a physical space. You'd hope to see that we're going to see much more investment in local areas, and that's, I think, part of the picture that really needs to be sort of solved at a policy level about what do we do with high streets that might struggle to see the footfall it might have had previously. Lots of big questions, I think, to talk about, which all have big implications. In terms of how we're feeling, it's quite a consistent picture to what we've seen in previous weeks, in so much as people feel worried. That's still the pervading emotion. We are still feeling restless, and 14% of people feel content. For those that are concerned about COVID-19, what we see is that levels of content and restlessness are about the same, about 20% for restlessness, and fluctuating between 13 and 14% for those that are feeling content. In terms of their level of worry, it tracks at 43% in the most recent weeks compared to 39 for the general population. And there's lots of things, I think, to think about with this that doesn't necessarily come front of mind for when sort of looking at how markets have responded when we think about things in a very kind of consumer-centric way. But there's some interesting data from the ONS just about how people relationships have struggled throughout this pandemic. Lots of kind of issues at home have come to the forefront. We've got 50% of those aged between 16 and 24 saying they're feeling lonely, and this has huge implications for not just their mental health and their kind of immediate environments, but also their inclination to engage with different companies and in different ways. And there's a tone, I think, that needs to be struck quite carefully with some of this stuff. In terms of brand reputation, I've been presenting mostly in the past few weeks about how they've responded to the pandemic. So we know from our data that trust is a really important component of a long-term loyal relationship. We've previously on these sessions been talking about how good or bad their response has been to the pandemic. So I thought for today I'll talk you through some of the trust scores and how they've evolved for some of the brands. Just showing you the top 10 brands. It's quite interesting to see who are the runners and riders that really stick out and have performed quite well throughout this pandemic. So Tesco have been consistently near the top. They were very keen or very proactive at making sure that their stores were safe for people to return to. However, in more recent weeks, you do see a bit of a decline in terms of their perception, and there's stories on the internet in the metro about how they're asking staff to take out on more duties rather than having to rely on third parties to do cleaning and things like this. There's also been an outbreak in very localized areas of COVID-19 in some Tesco stores. So they've had a bit of a, despite being top of all the brands we're measuring, they have had quite a rocky period. They're not quite as rocky as Iceland, where one of their policies fairly early on was that if you work in the NHS and you touch a product, then you're forced to purchase that product. And they backtracked on that. They also had issues with meeting their payment terms with HMRC, and have been in the news a little bit more for kind of health reasons. So we've seen this kind of real fluctuation in terms of trust as a brand. It's going to be interesting now that the founder of the business has bought back the shares and he's taken full ownership, to see how they respond in the coming weeks. I mentioned earlier about how we know that safety is a prime concern for people when they're thinking about going back to the high street. There's a really interesting new innovation launch from Sainsbury's that's going to be coming out. I think it's this week, or at least they're trialing it this week. I did see online, but it's going to enable you to queue from inside your car, which I think is really smart. So I'm sure you've all had the same thing when you've gone into town centres or you've been to the supermarket and you look at what the length of queue is outside a place. I don't know about you guys, but I often think to myself, I don't know if I can really be bothered to do that. I think I can wait to buy that product. I'll get it online, no rush, it's all good. And it very much is the kind of inconvenience is impacting our desire to go back and spend. I think it's a really smart idea to enable people to do that. In terms of the tech required is not necessarily a huge outlay in terms of capex investment to build that type of feature. It's relatively straightforward, depending on what your tech looks like. But there's certainly lots of out of the box solutions for that currently. So it'd be interesting to see around, as we're seeing that the trust scores have depleted to some extent for some companies, and they've struggled to ensure safety as well as experience for people. This could be an interesting way, an interesting test to see whether that improves perception of service. So I think that's a really interesting move on their behalf. In terms of banking, what you generally see overall is that we have seen a diminishing level of trust. Its trust scores are much lower than we see in retail and what we see in grocery. And for the banks as well, the delta difference between the top performers and the bottom performers typically is around 20 to 25%. So you do see quite a kind of narrow band of perception of trust. What you can see from the data, there was a bit of a dip in early May, and that's probably a halo effect of the announcement from the Bank of England that we're heading into our worst recession. Of course, that does trigger almost like PTSD, doesn't it, for how the bank, for those working in the banking sector, how they were viewed post 2008. And we've seen that the economy has shrunk at quite a considerable pace over the past few months. Although there is sign of some positive news coming out, particularly from the high street and some consumer markets, there's a lot of nervousness, of course, about being able to predict what might happen into the future. But Metro is an interesting bank to look at, and how, we've seen huge variation in terms of their perception. And some of the things that have happened for them have been, there's been an accountancy scandal at a board level, which has led to a new chief exec coming in, and they responded early in July, in the past couple of weeks, about now announcing that they are reducing some of the rates on their for some of their fixed cash savings products, which might be a response to the news from the week before. But we do see some quite considerable variation for some of the banks in this regard. When it comes to retail, what you generally see is that it's been a bit more of a flat line in terms of the perception of trust, and the differential between the top performers and bottom performers is actually around 40%. So you see a much greater degree of variation in the sector in terms of levels of trust compared to the banks. So I think there's a bit of there is something to learn here, I think, for those of you who work in retail or work in associated sectors, or if you're an agency that support brands in this area, there's a couple of key performers that are worth looking at and discovering why have they managed to maintain their levels of trust, when actually we've seen across all the brands we're measuring that trust scores have depleted over this period, which is related not purely due to the way they've responded to the pandemic, but is also to do with the general sort of sense we have in our society and our sort of level of frustration with the current situation. So it'd be interesting to see, as the mood improves, people feel happier. I guess we'll have to see what happens with the pandemic. But if we do see that the sentiment improves, what impact does that have on trust? And what impact does the way that companies respond to the changes in wherever we're going have on their perceived level of trust as well? You would imagine, or would at least hope, if you work in a sector, that as soon as the doors reopen for non-essential business last month, you would have seen actually trust improves. That's not the case we've seen. Actually, it's just remained largely static for most companies. There have been some improvements for a couple of brands that we've seen, but largely it's been relatively flat. And that comes down to this principle of, how do you ensure a safe and respectful experience for people, depending on their appetite for risk. And there's in terms of empathy and the way that you understand customers and the way you design experiences for them, all these, we need to empathize with all sorts of broad spectrums of people in terms of their attitude and their willingness to engage. So in terms of some of the kind of the macro picture, in terms of the economy and the way we're looking at things, still lots of question marks about where we're heading. There is some good news, it would seem, from the retail markets have seen some improvements, but I think policy is going to have a huge impact for our recovery. So fingers crossed, there's some decent decision making made. In terms of our feelings and the way that we feel within the UK, we're still very much looking forward to more experientially driven aspects of life, necessarily than strict commercial ones. That still is the case, and we still do have this kind of splintering in terms of how people feel with regard to pandemic and their intention to take risks, and that will, of course, will change as the picture in front of us evolves. So looking at the different sectors in more detail, I thought I'd lead with travel this week because it's very much top of mind, given what's some of the news that's come out around our restrictions with coming back from certain European destinations in the last week. And what we know is that there certainly is an appetite for travel. So 34% of the UK have been browsing holidays at least once this week. I've certainly been guilty of doing that, having a look where might be possible, where might be safe internationally. And this is higher compared to 2 weeks ago at 30%. So there is a pretty sizable growth in people looking online. But what we are seeing is that it really is the case that the majority of people really are just looking to travel in the UK. And in fact, 59% of people say they will travel only in the UK or will travel in the UK and possibly abroad at the same time, with 70% of them saying they would consider going to places they've never been to before. We're doing a bit of work at the moment with a UK destination. It's quite interesting to understand what the barriers and limitations for people to travel to places, and it really comes back to accessibility is quite a big thing. If it's safe to travel there and it's amenable, it's not too far away, lots of people would potentially consider new destinations compared to others. What we are seeing is quite interesting, that there's 30% of people would consider going to places they've been before. So there is some habitual behaviour that comes in. There's some routine. Obviously, it's all to do with uncertainty. Ultimately, if you've been to a place and you know how it works, you're going to feel more comfortable going there in the future because you've got a sense of the levers of how it operates, and it's going to make you feel more safe. And we know that safety is such a big aspect. So there's certainly intention there. It's going to be interesting to see what will happen, of course, when there's further changes to quarantine measures when we come back from different countries. For those on, in salaried roles, not necessarily on 0-hour contracts or on shift work, might be more inclined to take the risk of having to take the additional holiday, or might be employed by companies that are, who are willing to give them a bit of slack with return to coming back home. We'll see. There's certainly going to be different responses depending on lifestyle factors with people's intention to travel internationally. Overall, that intention to travel remains consistent for the past couple of weeks, and as you can see, in terms of people evaluating and browsing their holiday choices, we are seeing that has increased a bit over the past couple of weeks. But what's really interesting, ultimately, it really comes down to how concerned people feel, and it really shows that the less concerned you are, the more likely you are to be comparing, engaging, reviewing what feels right for you, what doesn't feel right for you, and this really does vary by generation as well. So we can see certainly older generations are more inclined to travel inside the UK. That they, if you look at people's intentions to travel internationally, it generally tends to be younger generations who are considering that more than older generations, which is no real surprise. But of course, what does this mean for the UK? For a lot of operators over here, it does present opportunities to secure that investment in local areas. It means for those in international tourism, it does mean there's potentially kind of a purposeful targeted messaging that could go out at different segments based on their level of concern, their appetite, and what would motivate them to travel into different places. So it's certainly the time to really get familiar and really empathize with different segments and understand what's going through their mind, and being able to track the stuff on almost a real-time basis to see how that evolves. In terms of grocery, we won't dwell too much in this sector for this week. It's a fairly predictable story in so much as we're seeing that online is performing really well. Amazon this week have actually announced that they're going to be stepping into or furthering their venture into the UK grocery sector. It's amazing how quickly they spin these things out, isn't it? Really, when you look at it. But they're looking at rolling out a UK-wide service by the end of the year. Now, it's kind of amazing to see. I think you'd sort of looking at it in terms of market forces and policy. I think it's interesting with the antitrust hearing yesterday in the States. What might happen in the UK? Who knows? But there's certainly much more of a narrative about the control of these types of organisations and their share of the market, and giving us as consumers much more variety. Speaking quite anecdotally with friends of mine, actually, over this period, have certainly felt that they wanted to support more local areas, and we've seen that in our own data as well, that there's been this huge drive, particularly amongst the older generation, to very much support local areas, which might become a bit of a factor for Amazon with its launch. But who knows? Let's see. I think perception, it's going to be quite interesting to see. They've managed it so far, being a company that can kind of cater to many things, be it books, be it your hobbies, your interests, be it music, be it web space and food. It's going to be an interesting one to see how they manage that communications wise, and potentially offers a bit of an opportunity for lots of different companies as well. We're seeing that online still performs really strong, and in fact, when you look at the share of those who are spending online as a sizable proportion of people in the most recent few weeks, 36% are aged over 55, so they're regularly now using online websites to purchase groceries and get it delivered to home. And there's further data from my previous employer, Nielsen, showing that in the past 4 weeks that actually online grocery sales have jumped 92%, which is staggering when you look at it. So a total share of the market of 13% now happens online in grocery. So really quite still a lot of growth in this sector. For entertainment, we're seeing a reasonably consistent performance, and I bring this up quite a bit in webinars because it's that question of how do people spend their time? How are they spending their time? Are they being idle with their time? Are they being quite productive with their time? We've seen during the peak of lockdown, actually, people spending quite a lot of time learning new skills. And we've seen in more recent weeks the interest in doing that has diminished somewhat. We're still seeing that music is very much, a medium people reach to very regularly, having on the background at home. You've probably seen Spotify launch their new ads about they used to have they had a subscription about where you can bring in your friends and family. I think £15-16 a month. They're now doing one for two of you at home at a lower cost, recognizing that during lockdown, lots of people have just had music on in the background, and it's just a way of kind of adding a bit of atmosphere to your space. I read this really interesting article years ago about how happier households tended to have music on in the background, which I thought was quite interesting. Different topic for another day, of course. But what's curious about more recent weeks is actually that the desire to learn new skills has diminished a little bit from 21% to 15% people who are learning new creative skills on a daily basis every 3 days or more. So it would indicate that there's people having to go back to work. They don't necessarily have the time, but there still is this desire to do things that are proactive. At the same time, it's sunny outdoors. People are going outside. They're trying to socialise as they can. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in our alcohol section, later on. But it might mean obviously this has an impact on people's intention to watch shows and that sort of thing. When it comes to home and DIY, the future intention to invest in the sector had been pretty strong over the past 8 weeks, people saying they're going to spend more into the future. We've now seen that level off. And we're seeing that in terms of people doing DIY at home, it's fluctuating at around 20% over the past few weeks. It's currently at 19% compared to 2 weeks ago at 21%. And 9% of the UK were looking at getting in support at home for contractors to come in and do things around the house as people feel a bit more safe. And of course, it's a sector that how I think it's quite interesting, having done this myself actually, how different companies are being proactive or not so proactive with how they will ensure safety when they come into the home environment. And that's something I think, as we've seen, retailers and hospitality being very really quite diligent in terms of how they communicate whether they're abiding by safety rules. In the contracting sector, I've seen quite big variation in terms of people communicating what their workmen do and how they ensure things remain safe. It's quite hard to do, of course, if you're knocking out a window. But it's interesting to see how that type of language and that type of assurance is not just limited to kind of consumer products in the consumer sector. It also has relevance in the home building sector as well. But certainly it's a steady performance, and in terms of people's engagement with it, it's pretty flat over the past few weeks. Now it's going to be interesting, of course, as the summer months draw to a close. Question marks over a second spike as we go into the winter, what we might see. But I guess one of the benefits of being able to measure this stuff at the start of the year is we've now got a really good picture of what might happen if restrictions become tighter again. So it's going to be really important, I think, to look back over time. In retail, the lead message here is that there hasn't necessarily been a mad rush back to the high street as there was before. The ONS, mad rush as we might have seen the first couple of weeks. The ONS reported that we have seen a month-on-month growth of nearly 14% in terms of retail sales, which is really encouraging. It's more than what they'd necessarily predicted, but as we know, there isn't necessarily the desire in terms of people's hopes and aspirations to get back onto the high street and to spend. And certainly looking at social data, when you look in more detail how people have experienced the retail environment, and we've seen this with clients of ours, that it's quite it's a really challenging one for lots of clients. Looking at that, the sort of sentiment that comes out is that although there might be a desire to go out and do things locally, organisations that have put in kind of strict measures or not so strict measures are perceived slightly different. So how you respond in terms of your safety protocols does have an impact on people's feeling of safety, but also their frustration of experience. And it's very much seen to be quite a suboptimal experience currently. And depending on the sector, we're seeing that some people still are, inclined to buy products online. So in the hobbies and interest sector, we've seen that there's a 2% difference in the proportion of people who are buying their products related to their hobbies of interest online. That it would indicate they're more likely to do it online than they are in store compared to other different categories of products. So it really depends on the type of thing that you're buying. Certainly in beauty has been an interesting one, because we've seen actually that there's an equal number of people buying online as there is in store. So it remains kind of neck and neck, as it were, at the moment. For clothing, we've seen over the past couple of weeks that's moved from 16% of people would buy online to 13% in the most recent data capture. Or sorry, this is looking at June, sorry. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in the coming months. We're only starting to see stories of how June performed in the category. So we'll obviously publish this data in the coming weeks to give you visibility on, is it actually the case that people are more likely to stick online, in which case, what are the opportunities? It's really interesting looking at some of this. It's kind of a resurgence, I think, for a lot of kind of shopping channels, or that type of delivery of streaming. So in China, it's quite a big thing for collections to be streamed. That a lot of fashion weeks have been, lots of companies that have been present at different sort of fashion week events over the past few weeks streamed their collection, and that seems to be something that happens quite a lot in China. It's something a client of ours uses to promote their products here in the UK, and it's actually proved to be quite successful for them. So it'd be interesting to see whether that's something that comes online a little bit more. It's something that over the years has sort of not necessarily been in the forefront of people's mind in a way of communicating their products, but could potentially be an opportunity longer term, where people want to get a feel for what something might look like, and to kind of try and get the best experience they can, when not able to get into store. Had a question for you all, about just based on my experiences of yesterday. I thought I would ask you before we launch into our alcohol section. I had a question for you. Don't worry if you don't drink; that's absolutely fine. But if you were to go for a drink with friends at the moment, what would be your preferred option? Question for all of you. So you have to pick your top one here. You can't pick loads, I'm afraid. Even if you sort of, I'm trying to force decision making in that respect. Be interested to see. So nearly all of you, oh yeah, nearly close. Over 80% of you have voted. So I'm going to close and share the poll. Again, do apologise, not the most perfect question I'm able to ask. So yeah, interesting. So 7% saying indoors at a pub. Yeah, I kind of missed that. I do miss it. I was saying to a friend, it's just those days where you kind of late nights in a pub. It's just such an amazing thing. I haven't done that for a long time. 27% of people saying outdoors at a pub. Same number proportion of people saying outdoors in a park. 40% of you, so the lion's share, saying actually outdoors in my home. So interesting, it would seem that the sort of variable that matters there again is about being outdoors where it's safer. Of course, we've had lots of communication about that, published by different organisations over the time period. And I think it's kind of interesting to see then how does that compare to the rest of the UK. So it's interesting to see actually it's broadly in line with how the UK feels. So if you ask people who do drink, where would they, if they were to drink with others, where would they go? Again, you've got the lion's share of those saying it'd be at home with others. You've got 21% of people saying they'd be happy to go to a park outside of home. And 15% said they'd be happy to go to a bar and restaurant. So longer term, why is this important? It's important for lots of different reasons. It's important because it sort of shows that for the hospitality sector, people don't necessarily feel so comfortable going to pubs, but also doesn't mean to say that pubs can't come to them. And I'm encouraged to see that there's lots of smaller enterprises like Signature Brew, based up in Walthamstow, are actually offering a pub in a box concept where you can get a bunch of beers delivered to your home, as well as a pub quiz and some snacks, and it can be quite a nice kind of thing to do with your friends. We're doing a project at the moment that's looking at what does the future of the match day experience look like, in partnership with the IPA. And it's really interesting sort of things that we're going to be looking at is, what does that match day experience look like if people aren't able to go to the stadium, aren't able to go to the pubs? What are they going to do? What kind of habits, new habits might come to fruition? So it's going to be an interesting one again about what are the new mechanics and mechanisms we can use to engage people if we can't necessarily engage them in our physical space. What are the other opportunities? And I think it's going to take quite a bit of imagination and determination to make these sort of things a reality as the lockdown measures have been relaxed and people are able to go to some of these physical spaces. Again, it's a mixed story. Don't be led necessarily by what you might see on social media in terms of people engaging. It's probably best to pull your information on this stuff from third-party sources that are looking at it across the board, because it certainly shows that there is still some there's not necessarily a kind of clamoring of interest to go to a field full of people to have these kind of raves that are happening, or to go to pubs, bars and restaurants. It is a bit of a slower return for some people, and it also depends on their level of concern with COVID-19. So lots of interesting things that are happening in this sector, and if you look at that across, across different, you look across different aspects of how people might consume alcohol, you can see there that there is a real difference, and it really comes down to people being able to be outside. Now, what's that going to be like as we move through the summer months and it becomes colder, the nights draw in? What types of behaviours might we expect? What type of social norming could we see? And what are the opportunities for brands who operate in this space? I think there's plenty of opportunity in there. I think it's just a case of trying to unpick the reasons why people are behaving in certain ways. If you look at, we've seen data over time about how people are feeling, based on whether you are working or not working. How are you sort of coping with being back at work? We're seeing that there's certainly a strong indication that people are more likely to go to the pub if they're currently in employment compared to those that are not. There'll obviously be an economic argument about it. There's probably going to be one about that sort of feeling you get when you Friday afternoon, you've had a busy week, and it's just that taste, that first pint. It's nice, isn't it? And certainly appears to be the case that those who are currently working are more likely to be inclined to visit physical spaces. And interesting as well to see safety is still really important to people as well. So we have seen that, as I mentioned earlier, if you are concerned about COVID-19, then you're less likely to be going to pubs at the moment. So these are really safety is still going to be an important aspect. And I came across this week, which is from a company called Bived, and it's the ability for you to get a sense of how busy a pub or restaurant is at a current given time. So you get a sense of how many covers are currently filled, whether there's actually any space for you to sit. I thought it was quite interesting, my experience reflecting on it, going to a country. I had a rare midweek day off. Actually, it was very nice. With a friend, we went out to the Surrey Hills, and it had lots of signage out front about all the safety protocols they were doing, and that was the reason why we went there. But when you go in, there's no indication of actually where you go and where you can sit in outdoors. And I think there was perhaps a bit of a missed opportunity to communicate that further forward. Now, this is an app that could potentially get around that by communicating where there is space and where that capacity level is at any given time, so that you can book knowing that it's safe. So we're likely to see some habit changes, and technology is obviously there to help people. In terms of beauty, we work quite a bit in this sector. I know Certainly in the certainly some of our clients who work in the sector have had pretty good couple of months, in terms of sort of salons, in terms of beauty parlors, things like that. There's been lots of people who invest heavily in this sector. We're just delighted to be able to get treatments again. We've seen that still online plays a massive role. And in fact, 20% of people would still be happy getting advice from their beautician online compared to doing it face to face. There's a huge opportunity with this. We have seen some innovations over the past couple of months, but as we move into a phase where, doors become open, not just, hair salons, gyms, and bars, pubs, restaurants, that the lots of companies have made use of streaming services and being able to connect with people at home. There's huge opportunity, I think, to distribute product, distribute experiences using those types of tools that could potentially expand audience and market share over this period. So I think it'd be worthwhile for companies to be kind of looking at less as a kind of restriction, actually more of an opportunity into the future. But certainly online is still really important in the beauty market. And when it comes to exercise, we've seen that behaviour remains relatively steady. You've still got 1 in 4 people using walking as their means of exercise. We're seeing that men are more likely currently to be running compared to women, but we also know that women overall are more likely to be taking better care of exercise, of themselves through exercise in general. And it's quite an interesting trend here. About 8% of people still using outdoor gyms. Now, I'm sure you guys have probably seen this, but in your local areas. But I've certainly noticed near where I live, certain parks have all this equipment that you rarely see people using at sort of 7, 8 in the morning if you go for a walk. But it's interesting to see over the past few weeks, actually, it's almost turned into a kind of mini gym near where I live, in Norwood Park. It's sort of 7:30, 8 in the morning. There's about sort of 10 or so guys who go there to sort of work out together. And it was interesting that only a few months ago, it was only a couple of people doing it. So it sort of created this kind of informal community. It's really quite amazing to see them sharing equipment, but giving each other space. Again, there's potentially opportunity there, which has been occupied by lots of different companies over the past few years. Those kind of, although I don't do it, the kind of army boot camps and things like that make use of lots of park space, and very much based on that kind of get out and get active premise. There's obviously going to be government policy that's going to feed into this. You'd presume we'll see, obviously, the Prime Minister's lived experiences of COVID-19, we should, you'd think, have an impact on kind of encouraging people to be more active and to exercise. And certainly weight loss is something that's very much at the forefront of the narrative at the moment. It'd be interesting to see whether it becomes policy in the next couple of months. So that's the kind of the headlines of things. In terms of we're entering into August, so of course, as you can imagine, we've been frightfully busy in the past few weeks, not just with client work and holidays and things like that. So we're actually going to be easing up a little bit with our publications of these reports. You can download the latest report on the website currently, so you can get that. You can also download our 55 plus report, which was released last week. Thanks for those of you that came onto the webinar. Lots of interesting discussions and debates to be had. What we'll be doing in the coming weeks is we will still be doing webinars, so that we'll still be doing webinars through August, and we'll be releasing our future of the match day in partnership with the IPA. Very much looking forward to getting that out there. I think it's going to be really fascinating. And there will be further updates on our COVID-19 tracker. We're going to be taking a retrospective view of things, because I think depending on where we're going, obviously we're in the summer, we have no idea what's going to be happening, but it's going to be really important for companies to understand, as we approach many different forks in the road, it's like a very multi-pronged fork. It's almost like a Swiss Army knife. Where we're going to go, who knows? But certainly if we see that there's lockdown restrictions are put in place, there's going to be some learnings we've had over the past 6 months that people are going to want to know. So we're going to be looking at that and pulling that out, as well as doing our usual updates every other week. So I just thought if you've got any questions, I'll just keep it open for a couple of minutes. We have kind of gone over a little bit. We normally aim to try and wrap these up in 45 minutes, but I do have a tendency to kind of give anecdotes as things occur to me as I go through it. So question that's come in here is, so it's about how, so I'll summarize it. How successful do we think virtual shopping experiences will be? I guess this is in relation to what I mentioned there about about shopping channels and the like. So obviously a lot of investment has been made to virtual shopping. You've got obviously Sainsbury's have launched this ability to queue from your car. I think it's which is slightly different problem, I suppose, to solving it. But it's probably too early to tell. There are learnings in other markets, though, that I think are worthwhile looking at. I know China has a very different kind of culture there, of course, but it's worthwhile, I think, looking at kind of how things have worked over there. There's plenty of businesses that have actually done virtual shopping, or at least given the experience of kind of added value through home distribution. The Chapper, I think, is the name of the brand, where you answer a bunch of questions about your styling preferences, and you can still get a personalized experience through the clothes that get delivered to your door. And there's all these really good returns policies with that as well. So there's loads of different mechanisms for virtual shopping experiences. I guess it's probably worth unpicking, what do we mean by a virtual experience? Do we mean it in the context of the Sainsbury's example that I brought up there, which is all to do with kind of safety and sort of security, as it were, all the way through to more added value services as well. Another question here: how do we think? How do we think people might respond to the second wave? That's quite tough. I guess we'll have a, there's certainly a lot of social norming that occurred when the lockdown measures were put in place, and we saw that lots of people abiding by the kind of rules that were put out there. I think there's some real important lessons we can see. I think a lot of this happens in partnership with how government policy works and how it's communicated, and the restrictions that we're given. We will know, of course, when we move into that scenario, that there's potential for stricter measures to put in place. I think it was announced that there was some kind of commentary about we'll never have another UK-wide lockdown. I mean, realistically, I don't know how anyone can say that without knowing what the future looks like. So it's quite hard to predict, but I think certainly depending on the type of measures that are put in place, we've got some pretty good data now to understand what might happen in the future. Of course, the difficulty is going to is the kind of seasonal aspect. All of this happened coming into Easter and the summer, where people can go outside and can do different things. And the experiences, the frustrations are made a little bit easier because it's a little bit more pleasant out there compared to what it'd be like in the wintertime. Yeah, queuing outside a Sainsbury's in an out-of-town CBD where it's freezing cold on a February morning or January, it's going to have a different level of frustration that occurs there. Yeah, so question here: surprised that only 7% of people who want to drink indoors in a pub, is that seasonal? Only 7%. Yeah, I suppose there is obviously a kind of seasonal dimension to it. I mean, it's wonderful outside. It's nice to be out, and I think people are really inclined, probably seeing that this is exacerbated by the fact that not only is it summer, but we've also been kind of restricted to at home. So I think it probably has a bit of a compounding impact in that respect. But again, it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out in the coming weeks. So I think I'll wrap it up there. If there are any other questions, then do give me a shout, and I can respond via email. But thanks very much for attending. Plenty coming in the over August, despite we will be trying to take the foot off the gas a little bit given that it's holiday season. But you can expect to see reports coming out in the coming weeks, and we will follow up with the slides from today's session and the most recent report for you to download. But have a good rest of the week, and I'll speak to you soon. Thanks for coming.